Next time you're in Boston or Cambridge on Sunday, I want to recommend to you that you go to Henrietta's table in the Charles Hotel for brunch. It's the best brunch in Boston. And this is not a paid commercial. This is to tell you that's where the next panel came from. So I was at something called the PAPSAC conference. Anil Jain was here, was at it, as was Marshall Bhutan, a dear friend who I've known for 20 plus years when he was executive vice president of the Asia Society, and we traveled in Asia together. Then he became president of the Chicago Council and turned it into this dynamo that's having influence every year. The Chicago Council Conference in Washington is a must-do. And he said, I've got an idea for a panel. I know some people in India. I'm going to get them together, bring them here, and we're going to add to it a presentation from McKinsey, who is my favorite organization, who has a standing invitation to be here. So, Marshall, if I want to invite you to the stage, and Pradeep, Prabhala, with a briefing from McKinsey, and then the panel is over to you. And Marshall will introduce everyone that he's brought here. And so, Pradeep, all right, so good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Thank you.
All right, okay. Marshall better be there. There he is.
There,
okay.
I'm here.
All right.
I'm here. Worry not.
Yes. Great. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having us. I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes talking about a topic that I'm deeply passionate about. And there are a couple of reasons why. I think one is I'm an Indian, and Indian agriculture is such a mainstay of driving prosperity in the country that it's going to be really important to talk about agriculture. And the second one is I've been doing a lot of work on thinking about how technologies could transform agriculture at large. And we've been sort of serving a lot of clients off late, and we think it's something that holds tremendous promise for inclusive agriculture in India. So I think both the topics are are things that I'm deeply passionate about, and I look forward to spending the next 15 minutes talking about why do we think these are important and what do we see as some of the trends in the space. When we talk about India, Indian agriculture, it's often full of contradictions. On one hand, I think we've had an extremely successful green revolution in the 60s. Are the largest producer, second largest producer of fruits and vegetables, and the largest processor of fruits and vegetables globally. We are one of the largest producers of cereals globally, which includes crops like wheat and rice. We also sort of provide livelihoods for 60% of the population from the agriculture sector perspective. But the other side of the story is that not all is great, because you actually find that we also contribute to the majority of the poverty in the country as a sector, right? And we also sort of think that some of the poverty metrics are not trending the right way. For instance, over the last decade, the debt that farming households do take on have increased fourfold, and incomes have plummeted by 300% on an average, right? Now, does it mean that all is doom and gloom? No. In fact, there are sections of farmers in India who are extremely successful, people who are growing horticulture crops, cash crops. But there's also a section of India with farmers who don't actually make enough incomes to have their livelihoods being met in a way that they would aspire to. So how do we really achieve an inclusive agricultural sector in the country? What do we think are some of the structural constraints? So effectively, we think there are a few issues that effectively preclude farmers from making more money. And I think the government of India has prioritized doubling farmers' incomes as a big priority. And we think that a few things that need to get done, right? One is you need to be able to have a line of sight from demand to supply for all the growers. And today, I think that's a broken system. That's because, one, a lot of procurement in the country is actually controlled by government in cereals. And in a lot of other places, you don't have enough demand to sustain the 70 million odd farmers who currently just grow staple crops. And added to that, not only are the demand and supply signals flowing through the system, you also have an issue of intermediation. There are a lot of benefits that the farmers are rightfully owners of wouldn't come to them because you have a system that's highly intermediated. Right? And the second issue is, even assuming that you got it right, I think do you have farmers actually buying inputs, and are there services being available to them? I think the story here is there's a very high cost to serve. We've seen that about 45% of landholdings in India are actually small and marginalized in the country. Smallholders typically incur 10 to 20% more costs in actually incurring the same services that typical mid-sized or large farm would incur. And then there are other issues such as lack of sophistication in farming practices and limited ability to manage risks. Right? So where does technology come in? It's true that there are a lot of these challenges, and we understand conceptually that a lot of these challenges could be addressed by using technology. And we've seen that typically when digital technologies or data comes in, your cost to serve goes down, your ability to manage risk because of data improves significantly. You could actually work with farmers to improve their farming practices and so on. But what's happening on the technology front? In general, I think we're seeing a huge revolution of technology in India. I think obviously a lot of people here know about the story of Indian IT services sector and how it's been the mainstay for a lot of the technology revolution in emerging markets. But we also see that a lot of farmers, for instance, today own mobile phones. There are 155 million farmers and laborers in the country today who own mobile phones, right, and can meaningfully engage with them and are fairly literate. There are about 4 million farmers who actually have used electronic applications to conduct transactions in the country. Now, added to that, I think with things like unique identity being done by the government of India provides you a huge technology platform on which a lot of solutions could be built that could effectively address the challenges. And we think that this is still early stages, right? I don't know how many of you know, by 2029, machines would actually match the intelligence of humans. And by 2050, we actually think that the machines would be at a point where they could progress technology at a pace that human mind would not be able to fathom, which all means that in the next 10, 20 years, you'd actually see a huge proliferation of some of these technologies, and what they could do to agricultural sector could be quite substantial. Now, what can they do? What can these technologies actually do for the sector? There are often people who tell me that, listen, these technologies are all great, but agriculture is too complex. There's a lot of technical understanding, and it's really hard for digital technologies to meaningfully change ways in which growers could do things. But in places like the US, we've seen medical systems being disrupted by technology. Today, a lot of people in this room would be comfortable going to ZocDoc and actually figuring out who's the doctor that they should go to, or actually doctor on demand to get medical advice, right? So, I mean, that's a far more technical sale. It's pretty unusual for people to visit bank branches in developed markets, which used to be a highly personal interaction with a financial advisor. So we don't think that any of the barriers in agriculture are insurmountable. In fact, we think that a lot of the challenges that people talk about in the sector could be addressed quite meaningfully using technology. There's some applications that we think could pave the way for improved agricultural productivity. These include things like providing better financing, because you can do credit risk now using digital technologies and find a far more effective way to check credit of people. You can actually do insurance by using tons of data that's available using satellite imagery. There are actually companies that are pioneering this. You could figure out ways to sell farm inputs online. Now, this is something that I get a lot of flack for. Can this really be done? I don't know how many are tracking the Alibaba revolution in China, for instance. Alibaba is actually growing e-commerce for agricultural inputs at a tremendous pace, obviously with support from the government, but it can be done. And then there are things like precision agriculture services that improve the farming. There are actually e-marketplaces that are changing the way selling and distribution could be done in agriculture in India. And we see a lot of these solutions being pretty promising. In fact, we think that the amount of value that can be unlocked through these technologies could be as high as about $10 to $30 billion by 2020. Right? We just took 3 examples of precision agriculture, agricultural marketplaces, and farm financing and insurance. And even these places with assumed penetration, I think these numbers roughly correspond to about 10 to 20% penetration in the overall country, which is not actually a lot. And even at those levels, we find a significant value could be unlocked by a lot of these technologies moving forward. So not surprisingly, you have a lot of digital players who are, we call them digital natives because these tend to be innovators, who are innovating on a lot of solutions for agriculture in India and are focused on leveraging some of these technologies. Now, not many of them have scaled. In fact, we have a person on the panel who's working in one of the technologies here. But essentially, I think we see innovation in broadly 5 or 6 spaces in India. One is we're seeing a lot of work in establishing market linkages using digital platforms. And this mostly is happening in the horticulture sector. We're seeing a lot of use of precision farming, which could hold tremendous promise because it not only reduces the cost of inputs, but effectively helps farmers apply technologies better. We see a lot of shared services for smallholders. For instance, the companies that are using Uber-like model to provide tractors, which effectively lower your which address your cash flow situation of the growers. You also have traceable solutions. You have personalized on-demand services, et cetera. So there's a lot of innovation that's going on. But I think the key question is, are they at scale and what would it require to scale them? And similarly, the government's been investing in these technologies and leveraging these technologies as well. For instance, I think there's a initiative of the government that's focused on developing online trading platforms called eNAMs, which is fairly ambitious. It already connects about 585 APMCs, which are agricultural produce marketing centers in each of the states. And the ambition is to link those with village-level markets by using a platform called Grameen. In addition, I think the government's also using technologies to drive things like subsidy management of fertilizers, delivering insurance services, and so on. So all to say, there's a lot of activity, and all this activity is relatively in the nascent stage. Not a lot of it is scaled. So the next question is, what would it take to scale some of these technologies as you move forward? We recently did a work with the World Economic Forum that was focused on understanding what would it take to actually scale technologies. And I think the big realization is you need a vibrant innovation ecosystem, as we call it, to drive scaling of these technologies. And which effectively means that you need base infrastructure that allows a lot of these companies to leverage these technologies. This infrastructure could include things like having basic network infrastructure or mobile connectivity. You want to make sure that there's some soft infrastructure like investments in fundamental research. There's actually opportunities or platforms for innovators to be able to translate some of the research ideas into products. The second area, which is very important, is you need to be able to develop compelling value proposition to consumers and farmers. And the reason this is important is a lot of people fail because they think if you have a product in your mind, it's going to work and farmers are going to adopt it. But the issue is we've seen time and again, even in developed markets, products are not adopted by consumers unless you have a hook that brings them together. And these hooks come in the form of either aggregating services or figuring out a way in which you're able to attach the service to the social context in which these consumers are living and so on. But I think that's going to be pretty critical. And also, it's not very simple to connect the last mile to the consumers and farmers, especially when you have such a fragmented setting in the country. So we think that's sort of a second key important part where you need to think through how can you work with the consumers. The third part, which is important, is what is the operating model for some of these technologies that make it viable? Often, I think this is the place where often the arguments are most fraught in our view, because people tend to classify certain goods as private and certain goods as public. But in reality, a lot of public-private collaborations are required for you to effectively run a viable model. So for instance, let's say that you're running a database platform that provides precision agriculture services. Now, for that platform to be effective, what you need to be able to do is to get a lot of people to work on that platform, right? Because data is power. You need to get a certain scale of data for you to be able to then provide advice based on the data and so on. But getting that first level of critical level of data is really the most challenging part. And companies often are not able to invest enough to be able to get there. So that's where the public financing and the donor financing becomes pretty critical as you move forward. And the last one is I can't overstate how important regulations are. Often governments are very quick to regulate these sectors or too late to regulate the sectors, and often the timing is often inaccurate. And governments are increasingly trying to understand how do these technologies scale, what is required from a government perspective, what do you need to do to effectively drive change. So all to say that I think these are critical parts, and as we look forward, we need to make sure that we're working through how could we scale some of these technologies to harness the potential digital technologies in agriculture in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pradeep.